Hey folks, I want to talk to you about this application Readio. I strongly recommend Readio to help grandparents and parents read to their grandchildren remotely when they can't be in the same room. Whether you're living across the country, across the world, or you're just gone on a business trip, Readio makes it easy for you to read to those young ones when you're away. It's a super easy tool that allows for video monitoring across the top of the screen so they can see you and you can see them, as well as having the book prominently displayed, making it easy for you to read to those young ones, or better yet, having them read to you. What I want you guys to do is go to cool-grandpa.us, look for the affiliate link for Readio, click on that link, and sign up today for your free trial. Hi, everybody. I want to introduce today's guest, Rebecca Fraser-Thill. Now, Rebecca may be the first person I've talked to from the state of Maine, but I'm not exactly sure. Now, Rebecca came to my attention because she had written a great article last summer called How Family Traditions Help Form Stronger Bonds. I'd reached out to Rebecca and got to know her a little bit more. And this episode's really cool because we talk about her relationship with her grandfather. We talk about the relationship her children are having with her dad. And then we talk a little bit about how traditions and rituals help build multi-generational bonds. And lastly, we touch a little bit about meaningful work for people that are in their, let's say, late 40s to 60s. Many of us are changing perspectives, changing family dynamics, and are looking for maybe more meaningful work in these, let's call it second half of our careers. We touch on a lot of things. Go to the show notes so that you can find the links to Rebecca's website, her article, How Family Traditions Help Form Stronger Bonds, as well as the book that she contributed to. I'm going to shut up, let you guys get into it, and sit down and enjoy this conversation with Rebecca. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us and talk to us about your grandfather and some of the observations you have around your dad and your kids, and then also some things around family traditions.
Great. I'm so happy to be here.
Now, one of the things I'd love to do is have you introduce your grandfather. Give us his name, a little bit of background, and then tell us some of the earliest memories that you might have of him and some of the activities that you used to do.
Sure. So I didn't meet one of my grandfathers, so I'll be talking about my maternal grandfather, Raymond Green, and he lived in New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey, and he lived about a half an hour from where we grew up, where my family was. And earliest memories. That's a good question. I mean, he's sort of just threaded in my memories since he was only a half hour away. And we saw them at least once a week, if not more often, both him and my maternal grandmother. And I think a lot of my memories are of him with the birds, actually, in the backyard. He really loved his birds. He would do a lot of tending to putting out bird feeders, spending time with them outside. I found that pretty interesting as a young child, and so I'd help him out and support him in his bird activities. That's a lot of my memories. He was retired pretty early on in my life, so he was able to be really present every time I was over their house. I spent a lot of overnights there as well, so I was really close to my maternal grandmother, so I have a lot of memories of her, and he's sort of there just supporting us and doing all of our silly activities together, which were many. We were very silly together.
That's awesome. I enjoy hearing that. And one of the things that, was jumped to mind was this idea of sharing his interest with you and how grandfathers can do that as a way of kind of connecting, but then also sparking interest in grandchildren, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I wasn't somebody who was naturally wanting to be in nature all the time. I'm a little bit of a bookworm. And so I do all my memories, as you asked me, of those early years are being outside with him, which is interesting. It's very much like sun and being outside and paying attention to wildlife in a way I wouldn't have otherwise.
Oh, that sounds great. Now, did you find that those moments were ones that really let you connect with him in terms of you might be doing some, just going around putting the bird seed in the feeders and things, but then being able to have some meaningful conversations with him while you're doing those activities?
That's a really great question. I do feel like there was space for that. I think activities are the best way we make space for meaningful conversations. Nothing's worse than when you sit down with somebody and say, so tell me about your life, to shut down a conversation. So it's best if we are doing something. And he was a big question asker. He actually would try to do those conversations that were like, let's sit and talk about school. And I always shut down, intriguingly, but I think we did actually have better conversations around the activities. And looking back, I actually wish I had made more space to spend time with him because, like I said, I was so drawn to my maternal grandmother, who was just a lot of fun that I think I missed some time with him, honestly, in that. And I got closer to him as the years went on. And she, for instance, would be in the hospital or in rehab centers. And I spent a lot of time with him during those times and got to know him a lot better during that. And then she passed away before he did. And some of my best conversations with him were after she was gone. So there was something about her presence that always sort of drew me away. And I think if he could have pulled me away to do more activities, that might have been good when I look back on that.
Sure. Now, when you look back on it, though, do you find that those activities that you were doing with him really laid the groundwork for those other conversations in middle and high school years and on?
Oh, it's a great question. And I think you're right. I had never thought about it that way. But yes, like the trust, the sense that we knew each other, it was built on all of those activities. And a lot of the activities were actually very mundane. My grandmother didn't like to go places in the car necessarily. So he and I would go and pick up dinner or grab some groceries. So we did a lot of errand running together, the two of us, and had a lot of conversations in the car then too. So I think you're right. That was foundational.
Well, and that's one of the things that I'm finding as I'm talking with other grandparents or other, let's say, adult grandchildren, is looking back on those activities as the way that grandfathers and grandparents in general can really start to lay the foundation so that as you start to get into those middle school and high school years and beyond, you do have that level of trust. You do have some connections that are already there. It's not quite as awkward as here's this old guy that shows up. He has a grandfather title, but I don't really know him that well.
It's an excellent point. I think you're absolutely right. Just having that familiarity is so crucial to being able to have the bigger, better conversations later on.
Yeah, well, and because sometimes I'm talking with other grandfathers and I'm talking, even dads as well, is that don't discount those activities that we sometimes might think are just throwaway activities. Like, for instance, you brought up that, hey, we got in the car together. We went to go get dinner. Well, for you, that's probably, you may have had an important conversation with him about, whatever it is. To him, he doesn't remember it because it was me and Rebecca. We're getting in the car. We're having some fun. We're getting dinner and we're coming back. But the impact that those small activities have with building relationships and building community and safety within the family, I think are really important.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, and that the importance of presence, we know that from developmental psych. It's really more a person's presence that you are there. You are, especially in those adolescent years, we just want the person to be there, even if you're not having major conversations. That presence piece is so key. And I definitely experienced that myself.
Sure. Now, how did you find that relationship changed a little bit and morphed as you went into, let's say, the middle school and high school years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like I probably did the natural adolescent thing. I pushed away for a while there, right? Which is so normal, and I think is probably very hard on parents and grandparents to have that happening, where I just got busy with a million activities, and I felt like my grandparents were a little bit of a something a have to do rather than a want to do, which is very unfortunate. And then in college, I rediscovered the joys of my grandparents, I will say, in a very real way. And they gave me space. I mean, they never made me feel badly about that. They said, "You're busy, you're happy, you have friends, go enjoy." They never shamed me for being a normal teenager in that way. And that laid the foundation for me to bounce back to them and really want to talk to them in my college years in a big way, like make the effort to call them up, not because I had to, but because I wanted to hear their voices. And that's not something I did in the teen years, I would say.
Sure. And I think that's an important point that you brought up, though, is for grandparents um, to be able to give that space. We went through it as parents of, oh, my daughter doesn't want to talk to me in public. I embarrass her, those sorts of things. But as grandparents, sometimes I think it's hard for our relationship to go through that phase of like, oh, this is grandpa's little girl, wants to help me with the feeders, but then being able to go, you know what, she's 13, she wants to go be with her friends. I need to let her do that so that, later she can come back to us. If we're forcing a lot of family activities on her, if we're forcing, any kind of guilt, boy, that just would probably keep a young person away.
Absolutely. It's really important to understand where the developmental process is and respect it, and not take it personally because it's not about the individual. My grandparents were just as wonderful during my teen years as they were at any other point, but I was a different person then.
Oh yeah, I mean it's just natural at that adolescence to be wanting to push away from, let's say tradition or how you've been growing up and experiment with new ideas and beliefs and friends and activities, and I think giving people the space to do that and explore is important.
Absolutely. So key.
Now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about too was get your insights as a mom with how your dad is interacting with your kids and how his grandfather experience is going.
Yeah, it's been really fun. It's to watch. I have two kids who are 6 and 10, almost 11. And so he's got a decade of grandparenting and under his belt with my children, but he's actually my sister has a child who's 16. So he's got a good amount of grandparenting under his belt in general. And it's been fun to watch him, in particular with my son, who's the youngest, he's 6. And because he's the first male in the family, like it's me and my sister, and then we we both had girls first, and then we have this boy, and this boy is so genetically like my dad. It's a little bit wild. They have not gotten to spend as much time together as my daughter and him have because of circumstance. I mean, one, we've had this pandemic running and we live a number of states away. We're 400 miles away from them. So that makes it really hard to make it work during the pandemic. And we had some health issues in the family prior to that created some distance. So we've had to do a lot of Zoom types of activities in my son's lifetime. And it's just marked how much my son is like my dad in terms of interests, ways of viewing the world, the ways of wandering through the world. And it's not because of my dad being there all the time by any means. It truly is like it's just wild genetically. And so to see my dad be able to light up and have this excitement, they have a shared love of like engineering types of thinking. And my dad's a computer aided circuit board design person. And that's like, I could see my son doing that. And so he'll send my son circuit boards, right? Like printed circuit boards and be like, hey, check this one out. And it's just really fun to get to see that connection that my dad didn't really get to have with other people. I was sort of that way, but I just had a little bit of that, just an inkling. And my daughter and my niece not engaging in that way at all. I don't think that's purely gender. I think that's just who they are.
Sure.
So So it's been really fun to like see the spark of my dad being able to see a little bit of himself, I think, in my son.
Oh, that's cool. Now, how have you noticed any of the differences between the interactions? Because there are going to be differences, and those differences are typically really natural. It's part of its personality, part of it is just, let's say, gender preferences between play and activities. But what are some of those differences that you've seen?
Between the two children, like
Yeah,
how he
yeah.
interacts. Yeah, I think my daughter is a very high energy, like zany kind of kid. She's the drama kid. She's in the theater singing, like very big personality. And my dad is not a big personality. He's somebody who chooses his words carefully, doesn't speak too often, and when he does, he has something he really needs to say. So they're very different people, the two of them. And he always did a great job of like just kind of laughing her off and being with her and being present. They couldn't really share a whole lot of activities because they're so different in personality. And but he's always been wildly supportive of her and coming to all her events, and he always just says she's a character, which is about right. And he used to say that about me. I'm very similar to my daughter. And then my son and him, they will sit and be quiet and pore over some robot that they're creating for an hour, quietly with like no sounds coming out of the room. And that's pretty fun. I think he feels that's a little more like his up his alley, if you will. And grandma, his wife, my mom, runs with my daughter because they're very similar in personality. And so it's been great to have that sort of, they each have a room to go to with a kid. And my husband and I breathe a sigh of relief for a moment. And that's been one of the big losses of the pandemic, is not having that right now, in any big way. So that's something we look forward to regaining, as we all get boosted and vaccinated and all these other layers of protection going forward.
Oh, sure. Now, do you find that your daughter kind of pulls things out of him that are he may not normally engage in that, right? But it's like she can somehow pull out a bit of a prankster or a bit of a wild card in him that's not typically there.
Yeah, I think absolutely, to an extent. There's usually a limit, but there's definitely, to an extent, that he'll go along with her zaniness. He'll let her paint his toes and random things like that. I mean, one of the great stories from my childhood, very similar to my dad being grandpa, is that he patiently sat in my hair salon when I was a young child and let me pour hand lotion over his head because I told him it was shampoo. I still can't imagine like being a dad and just being like, fine. Like, I don't know if he didn't realize I was doing it or what, but hand lotion in your hair isn't good. And I've seen him do that as a grandpa too. Not to that extreme. I think he learned his lesson to not allow it to get to that point. But he's definitely will go along with whatever new shop or idea she is creating in the world, which she's always creating something. Some video, and he'll sit and watch and laugh at it and say, "You're a hoot." That's usually his his response to it. "You're a hoot."
Oh yeah. Well, and now as she's getting a little bit older, are there moments where you're kind of starting to prod her in the background as far as, "Hey, go ask grandpa about this story from his past"? Not necessarily like, "Hey, this was kind of an embarrassing or a funny story that that grandpa should share," but kind of as a way of like, "Hey, this is a good little connection point."
Yeah, it's a great point. I think I need to do more of that. She's just turning 11, and she's just starting to show an interest in family stuff, like, in that we all had lives prior to her. That's only beginning. Like, it's just beginning. Even to think about me and her dad as being humans who had a whole history prior to her is just starting to be like, huh, really? In a bigger way. She always knew it, but now it's starting to be like, tell me that story. I want to know. And I think you're right. I need to do more of that in relation to her grandparents and her grandpa in particular, in a big way. Both of her grandfathers are alive, so both of them in a big way.
That's great, because I find that sometimes that prompting of, hey, go ask grandma this or go ask grandpa that, is a way that can kick off that kind of hour-long discussion as far as diving into some of the family history, diving into different points where, it can build some other connections too. And like you said, the kids are still pretty young. It's not like it's a 15-year-old that's telling, hey, tell me about what it was like to grow up in the 60s.
Yeah, we're not quite there yet,
Right.
but I think you can see it coming on the horizon.
Yeah, definitely. And that's probably something I would encourage parents to do, is if you've got those moments, prod the kids a little bit to go ask those questions, because typically I don't think grandpas and grandmas necessarily volunteer that activity, that information. Not that we withhold it, but I'm also thinking in terms of, it's not something you lead with at Thanksgiving. Like, oh, hey, sit down. Let me tell you what it was like to grow up in the 80s and go to a Billy Idol concert and, do this stuff, right? It's you're kind of in the moment, whatever the kids are doing, but it's a great way to share those family experiences and I think humanize the parents and the grandparents.
It's an excellent point. I totally agree.
So I do want to talk a little bit about an article that I found that you had written a while ago, and I'm going to put the links to the show notes in it, but it was about how family traditions help build and form stronger bonds. And I really like that idea of traditions within the family and, new traditions as well. We've got our holiday traditions, that come up that maybe, put the jack-o'-lantern out front, do some of those things. But I think too that there's some values in some other family traditions or traditions within traditions, let's say.
Absolutely. I think there's certainly the holiday linked ones, but thinking about what's meaningful to a particular family matters a lot. And I got to expand on this a little bit too there's a book that I got to contribute to on some of this called In Good Faith, where the writer Maria Polanchek was looking into all the ways that you could create tradition and do all sorts of what she called secular parenting, so that there's the sense of what we often get from religion, even if we aren't religious, that we can create that. And holidays and other forms of tradition are really important for creating that for families.
Yeah. Now, what was some of the things that you found? And I'm going to put a link to that book. I'll find it and put it in the show notes so folks can check it out. Because one of the things that I think is really important with traditions, and something that I'm coming from that Scoutmaster, Little League coach, background, where there's rituals and traditions within those activities, is within families. It helps, I think, with some identity and safety and some other things. Can you talk a little bit about what you found on that?
Absolutely. So going through the research on this, there's like 5 major ways that this matters. It helps with our, that all of these traditions support us. They help us with our sense of belonging. They definitely help us build our sense of identity. Any of these we could dig into more, of course. They also help us give a sense of stability, especially during tough times. There's a sense that at least there's something to rely on. It also can, if we engage the children in the activities, that can help them feel useful and like they're needed in a very important way. And it creates some lasting positive emotions and memories that people can draw on throughout the future, including after loss. So it transcends loss, because you have memories of those people being involved in those traditions, even if they are no longer with us physically.
Yeah, I think that's important especially for little kids when there's disruptions, a loss of a grandparent or a parent or whatever that might be. Or, within the pandemic, right? You had Little League seasons canceled, you had drama, the school play was canceled, things that the kids were looking forward to. And, I think some of these traditions, whether it's within just, let's say, the nuclear family or the family at large, can help with some of those stressors or whatever we want to call it, sense of loss.
Absolutely. Stability is so key. And I think it's and there's ways to keep the traditions going, even if we have to do them in a unique way. Like for Thanksgiving, we like to do, it's actually a tradition I started in my own family, and now it's sort of become part of my extended family does it too, where we do a Thanksgiving bingo. Well, we're watching the parade because my kids used to not want to watch the Macy's parade, and I like to watch it. So I came up with this idea of that we're going to play bingo. So I'm going to make cards where the things that are in the parade are on a bingo card. So it would encourage them to watch the parade with me. And so we did that over Zoom the past couple of years. We weren't physically together, and we were able to play Thanksgiving parade bingo over Zoom with family members. And again, that created that stability, right? That was something that we could say, yes, that's still happening. Yes, we're still doing this silly little zany thing. And it's happening even though they're not physically with us, and we can do it like that. So I think that's really key for us, for my family. For instance, St. Patrick's Day is a big one. And even when we couldn't get together, like, I mean, so the pandemic hit right around St. Patrick's Day, right? We were like, my parents were about to come up, literally about to come up to see my daughter in a play and do the St. Patrick's Day thing. And then it was like 5 days earlier that everything was like, don't go anywhere, right? Like, stay put. And so still, it was important for my daughter that we still made the Irish soda bread and like pulled out the decorations and created that sense of like something's still happening, even though the world has just really gotten shaken up, and everything she was relying on, her school, her play that she had practiced 3 months for, and the visit by her grandparents to do this were all gone. We were able to say, this tradition lives on. That's still here.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, a question I've got for you is, as I'm a pretty new grandpa. I've got a 3.5-year-old grandson's the oldest, and like a year and a half. This is horrible. This is where grandmas come in for sure, right? She'll tell you the year, the month, and the date of how old that me, I'm like, he's between 3 and 5, somewhere in there. But I'm thinking in terms of how do like new grandparents and newer families start to think about building traditions? What are some things that maybe we should keep in mind? What are some, do we do something year one and then that's it and we're going to make it work? Or, what are some things that we should keep an eye on?
Oh, it's an excellent question. I think being clear in what your goals are, like what do you enjoy out of the holiday or out of the experience, whatever it might be. It might not be a holiday tradition. It could be a tradition that's built around something else. Like we have a last day of school tradition, for instance, in my family, right? It could be built around a lot of different events. So thinking about, well, what's meaningful to you about that? Like I had the parade for me is something I like to watch for Thanksgiving. I don't know why. It's just my thing. Actually, I do know why. It's because it was my mom's thing. So there you go. So you got passed right on down. So it's what do you value? And if you gain clarity around what you value, then what's the way you can make a fun tradition around that, like the bingo, for instance, that will be age appropriate and not just feel like you need to engage in this, kids, because I said so. So can you create an age appropriate element to it in some way? And then not be disappointed if it doesn't go swimmingly year one, because it's probably not going to. And the young kids might, engage in it for a period of 5 minutes total and then be done with it. And that doesn't mean it's a bad tradition. It means bring it back the next year and 5 minutes is a win, right? As they get deeper into it, they'll start asking for it. I was a little bit of that person, what they often call that kin keeper person for a while in my family, where I'd be like, we have to do things the way we've always done them. Even in the teen years when I was pushing away, I was always like, we need to have everything the same for all of these pieces. I think because so much is swirling in the teen years, you do want that stability. And I hadn't really engaged in a lot of the activities like crafting after we eat Thanksgiving dinner, but then all of a sudden I really wanted that. So because they kept doing it year after year, like grandma, and kept doing it year after year. So I saw it as a thing and then I wanted it. And I think that's key to keep in mind.
Well, I think that was really important because what you were saying in terms of they kept doing the crafting year after year. And as we talked about earlier, those teen years where you don't want anything to do with family. You come in, you eat Thanksgiving, and then I'm taking off. I'm going to the movies with my friends, whatever it is. That very next year, that very same person that wanted nothing to do with it is sitting at the table and is the one saying, you guys aren't doing it right.
Exactly.
That sort of thing.
Exactly.
So
yes.
I think that talks again about grandparents and parents giving those adolescents space, but then the traditions are there also as that grounding point, right? And
yes.
And even if they're pushing away from it, continuing with that tradition, if there's still benefit and use for it, is very important for those kids.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's important to ground it in what you value and what you want to be doing too, right? Because if a child or a teen only engages in it for a matter of minutes, you don't feel like, well, I did all this for you and have resentment around whatever it was, but more say, I wanted to be doing this. Wow, they at least saw me do this and they engaged in it for a short period of time. And that's something. That's the start of something. And that's important. I know the first year I did the parade bingo, I don't think we lasted more than between one commercial break. And I was very disappointed, but it was like, all right, no, I at least saw that. And with a toddler, that's a win, right? Yeah. Like toddlers, they're not going to watch anything. They're not going to sit still. And you have to recognize where they are developmentally. Again, that developmental knowledge, I think, is just invaluable for parents and grandparents to have.
Absolutely. Now, another question I've got for you is, do you differentiate between a tradition and a ritual?
Great question. I do differentiate between the two. Rituals tend to be more repeated more often. So a tradition tends to show up more like on an annual basis, or, it's not as frequent of a basis as a ritual. A ritual, for instance, we have bedtime rituals. We may have them on a literally daily basis, our rituals. The way we do our mornings are somewhat ritualized. What we do after school, there's rituals around that. So they're much more frequently occurring than traditions that tend to show up on a much less frequent, often annual basis. So yes, they are different. And the rituals are intended to create some sense of routine and sameness from day to day or week to week. If it's like a weekly ritual, right? Maybe it's like, this is what we do when we go to Little League every Sunday. And there's a ritual to it. That's very different than a tradition in that way.
Yeah, because I was thinking a little bit in my own head about this and thinking, and let me know if I'm wrong or right or off base, whatever, but that, a tradition would be after we go see the school play, we go for ice cream. The ritual part is we always go to this particular Baskin Robbins afterward. You know what I mean? Where it's like, hey, ice cream is the tradition.
Yeah.
But the ritual is the specific piece of that, I guess.
That's an excellent way to make that, to distinguish that. Absolutely. I could see that.
Oh, yay. I was right about something.
yes.
My day's awesome now. Thank you.
That's great.
No, but because rituals are important in of themselves, of that repeated piece, right? We're talking about the brushing the teeth and everything else. But I think there can be danger sometimes in getting the ritual confused with the outcome of a tradition. And that, to your point, hey, we want to get together and do crafts after Thanksgiving. The tradition is getting together to do crafts. We're not making, let's say, Christmas ornaments, and that's all we're doing after that.
Excellent point. Yeah, it creates some freedom for exactly the form or the expression of the tradition, which is very important to have room around that, because otherwise it gets stale and boring and people don't want to engage in it. We have to do it the exact same way every time. That's no fun. Especially teenagers are going to chafe in that.
Right. Where the tradition and the goal, let's say the goal of the tradition is the family being together. It's not as important as far as that we're going to that particular Baskin Robbins for ice cream, but we're going to an ice cream parlor to go get an ice cream after the event to celebrate the kid.
Absolutely. Like we have a tradition after trick-or-treating that the kids come in and like throw their candy down on the ground to sort it, and they watch Curious George's Halloween during that. And my daughter said to me this time after we watched it, she says, I think that's the last year of this. We need to pick a new show. She's 10 going on 11, right? Like, and the other one's 6. So it's like, and I was like, good point. So it's like, she didn't say we don't do this anymore. We don't trick or treat. We don't throw our candy down. We don't watch a show while we do it. But she's like, we got to pick a new one. And I was
sure.
like, fair enough. A new expression of that same idea.
Yeah, no, that's great to take that feedback and then also be able to, hey, we can morph this. We can adapt it. So.
Yep, we got to find something a little more age appropriate next year. Curious George isn't cutting it anymore, apparently.
Yeah. Now, Rebecca, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the other work that you do, which is some of the coaching and speaking around finding fulfilling work. And have you talk a little bit about what you're doing with that? Because I find that there's a lot of grandpas or men and women around this, let's say late 40s into their 60s, that are at a point where, hey, I've worked where I've needed to work for, let's say, the last 20, 30 years, and I want to do something more meaningful over the last 20 to 30 of my working years. And have you talk a little bit about what you do with that and how you help people out?
Absolutely. Well, it's highly related to what we've been talking about, really, because I take a very expansive view of the word work. I certainly paid work is a piece of our work, but I see work to be how we spend our days, the endeavors we put energy into on a repeated basis and have a commitment to. And so I put grandparenting and parenting under the umbrella of work, not in a bad way, like, oh, this is hard, horrible work, but just as it's an endeavor we put energy into in a very real way, and we're very committed to it. And then we have our paid work too. And so I do a lot of coaching around the conversation of like, well, how do you want to be spending your days? That's really the big question. What is your desired impact? And based on our understanding of your personality, your values, your interests, your preferred skills, how do we go about sculpting your days, your work, whether that be paid, unpaid, or a combination of the two, to meet those foundational elements of who you are and work towards that desired impact. Even just gaining clarity around what is your desired impact is wildly important. So even in the grandparenting domain, like knowing, well, what do I want my grandchildren to remember of me? Like, what kind of grandparent do I want to be? It might look really different than the parent I was. I know that about my paternal grandfather, who I spoke about with the birds, and that's not who he was when he was working. I've heard plenty of stories from pre-me where he was very stressed out and a very different parent than he got to be as a grandfather. He was a very different, like wonderfully grandfather to me. And so you can make that choice, like, maybe constraints made it hard for me to be the parent I wanted to be, but I can be the grandparent I want to be. So then what does that mean? How do you break that down into the day-to-day? And also thinking about, as you move through the paid work experience later in your career, what changes do you want to make? And then, like many people say, oh, I can't wait to retire. But retirement is not like just all roses. The research shows there's the honeymoon period, and then there's usually a disillusionment period. So I work with many people who are technically retired, but are finding some paid work, like on a part-time or consulting basis, and really structuring their unpaid hours to be more thoughtful, purposeful, engaging, and impactful, so that they're feeling like they're making the most of the retirement years as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Because one of the things I definitely like to push for folks my age, let's say in my age, it's really, I'm 51 going on 52, but this idea of just hunkering down and waiting until retirement from your day job, I don't like that anymore. I don't like that. I don't like that model that my father had. And I want men and women our age to be happy with that. We're in a new phase of our lives a lot of times, whether we have grandkids or we don't have grandkids. So I'm excited to hear that you're working with folks in my generation. And kind of early Gen X to really maximize these last few years, because I hate that idea of retirement of just not doing anything.
Absolutely. It's a dangerous vision because I mean, the research is just so clear that it sets up this idea that it's going to be such a wonderful period. And many people, that loss of purpose that comes with paid work is really disorienting. So it's not necessarily the thing to be striving for. It's really thinking about how do I make the most of these days right here and now, that I know I have in hand, and then figure out what am I going to transition into next. It's a next. It's not a this is ceasing and it's over. We can't get my dad to retire. He's now, I think, 76, and he won't retire because he likes his work so much. And that's after having been laid off in his 60s when he was thinking he was getting close to retirement age. And then the whole market changed and everything. And he went through a period of unemployment, which kind of was like a vision of what it could be like to be retired. And he was like, nah. And so he found another job doing what he loves doing. And like I said, he's still full time. I mean, he's not even going back down to part time because he likes that sense of purpose that it brings him. And he's got enough flexibility to be able to do the other things he wants to be doing around it. So there's lots of visions of what it can mean to be aging. And we know that from developmental psych, successful aging typically involves staying stimulated in a variety of ways. We actually live longer and better when we're highly stimulated and having a lot of changing inputs, which includes having people around us and having cognitive stimulation. And paid work does provide that to us in many settings. And if it doesn't, then we need to make some changes in somebody's paid work to help them successfully age.
Now, Rebecca, how would people best get in contact with you if they're interested in learning more about your coaching, learning more about the speaking?
Yes, absolutely. So the best place to go is to my website. It's you can get to it easiest, just Rebecca F as in Frank and then T as in Thomas. It's just RebeccaFT.com. And that'll take you right to my website where there's information about my speaking and my writing and my coaching.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. And I'll be sure to put those in show notes, folks, as well with the article and the book that we talked about. So you can go there and find those links if you didn't have something to write down with right now. Rebecca, anything else that maybe I haven't asked you about in terms of your grandfather, your dad, traditions or the coaching business that you'd like to talk about?
I think we've talked about a lot, which has been wonderful. And I would just say that to your listeners that it's never too late to start to build different habits, right? We often say, oh, well, I wasn't doing that, and now my grandchild's a certain age and it's too late. It's never too late. You can pick up and make new traditions and change relationships at any point along the way. And I think that's really important to remember, that it's not like something's just set down and it's always going to be this way. And I've definitely seen that malleability, that adaptability in my own family, and I've appreciated that. And when you're working with kids and grandkids, you have to be open to how dynamic development is. So it's if you want to start now, start now.
Oh, that's great advice. And Rebecca, thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. I sure have enjoyed this conversation.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
What a cool conversation with Rebecca. I enjoyed talking to her, learning more about how her relationships between herself and her grandfather changed and evolved over time. I think that's one thing that we don't necessarily talk about a whole lot, is that these relationships that we have can be very intense in one phase of life and then cool off, let's say, for a while, and then come back and be super strong. The other thing I like talking about too, of course, was rituals and traditions. I'm fascinated on how we can use rituals and traditions within the family to create these multi-generational bonds. And if you don't have any family traditions or you don't have any family rituals with your family or between you and your grandchildren, think about what are some of the things that you can do to start to put in place so that when the grandkids are talking about you, they always go, oh, we always did X with grandma. We always did X with grandpa, right? The last thing I loved too was talking about meaningful, purposeful work. So many of us are still working grandparents. We still have goals and ambitions that we have, and we may be finding ourselves at this stage of life questioning whether the work we have has any meaning for us. And what do we want to do with the next 20, 30 years of our work life? So we will have Rebecca back on to the Cool Grandpa podcast just to talk about meaningful work. So be sure to check your podcast feed over the next month or two, and you'll be hearing more from Rebecca. So until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.